So we're in our one question series. If you could ask God one question, what would it be? And for so many of us, there were so many good questions. There was like over 30 questions, but so many of them had to do with suffering that we needed to do it in 2 weeks. Today is part 2, because last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about why does God allow suffering? I mean, if he's good, if he's all-powerful, why not do something about the suffering? And 2 weeks ago, we affirmed our belief that yes, God created a good world. And yes, human rebellion damaged it and continues to damage it. And our faith is based upon God acting in history to make things right. That God came as a person, Jesus Christ, who suffered alongside us to redeem and restore the world eventually. That one day, all will be made right, well, and whole again. And we are convinced that is true. But that does not make the pain go away. That's what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. We still suffer. We still doubt. We still grieve and mourn. We have a God who grieves and mourns with us, a God who understands the depth of loss, the depth of pain and suffering, because he too experienced that. But it does not make it go away. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that we live in a world full of pain and suffering and grief and abuse and trauma and all of these things? How do we live through the suffering? And that is today's question that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to share a lot of stories. This was a hard message for me. And so I just want to invite you at the, later on, not necessarily today, but if you have any questions, I want to encourage you, please let me know. You can always text our text number, or you can just email me at don@avalonchurch.org. Those are just, I would love to answer any questions or even just discuss some things, because I have a feeling a lot of us are going to relate to today. When my wife Jennifer, as most of you have heard if you've been here before, when she passed away, I was 21 years old and so was she. We were married for 2 years. I was 6 weeks away from college graduation. I'd been a youth pastor for 2 years at First Baptist Church of Lantana, Florida, which is a kind of a small inner city church. And Jennifer and I had grown the youth group to about 30 students. You got to think about a youth group with a 21-year-old leading it, and you kind of understand pretty quickly that because we didn't have kids, we didn't have a life outside of, we both work. I went to college, she worked. This was our ministry together. Those kids, they loved us, right? We had invested in them. We were a part of their life. You can just imagine how special Jennifer and I both were to them. So when she died, it didn't just wreck my life. It wrecked all of our lives, all 30 kids. And there was this one 16-year-old student. His name was Jason, and he was a tough one. He started coming to our youth group because he was dating one of the girls, which is, missionary dating. I guess it works because, I'm just kidding. But he started coming to the youth group. And Jason was one of those people that he was too cool to play the youth group games, sing the youth group songs. When we'd have discussions, and man, they were good. He never participated, but he was always there. Jason never smiled. Never. But not with me, because Jennifer could always get a smile from him. I remember at Jennifer's funeral, Jason sobbed on my shoulder as we stood by the graveside. A couple of weeks later, when we met for the first time as a youth group, all we could do was just talk about our grief. We could cry together. It was like, for a while, there was no youth group time. It was just come together and sob and cry. And Jason always was there. And I don't remember how it all worked out, because a lot of that is a fog for me. But at some point in the next couple of months, Jason chose to follow Jesus. And one of my last memories as youth pastor there was baptizing Jason. Now, when I did that, I remember this moment very clearly. One of the church members came to me and hinted to me that maybe Jennifer's death was worth it so that Jason would come to faith. And I remember thinking, no. Her death was awful. Who knows what it could have come with her life? Maybe her life could have not only influenced Jason, it could have influenced hundreds of other kids. We don't know that. Death is awful. I remember thinking, death is not part of God's plan. Nothing is worth it, is what I was thinking. But Jason choosing to follow Jesus, part of because Jennifer died, does reveal a truth in tragedy and suffering. That the bad can be really, really bad. But in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the bad, in the midst of hopelessness and darkness, God and good can unexpectedly show up. Good that could have never happened had the bad not happened. Now, it doesn't justify the pain. It doesn't justify the suffering. It's just good seems to have a way of rising up sometimes in the midst of awful circumstances. Suffering has a way of opening up our eyes to what is important. Suffering and pain and tragedy and loss have a tremendous capacity to initiate change in us, both good and bad. I do not want to say it's always good, but I also don't want to say it's always bad. It has the potential for both good and bad. That's the tension we live in, beauty and pain, hope and fear. We have this tension between wonder and darkness and joy and sorrow. In the early years after Jennifer died, it felt like I was standing at the base of a huge mountain of all-consuming pain, kind of like this. So I'm at the base of this mountain that literally I thought would crush me. When Jennifer died, I mean, for the next year, 2 years, 3 years possibly, I truly believed that the despair would last forever. I thought that I was always going to feel the way I was feeling. I didn't, but I didn't know that at the time. I had people tell me, and I had to trust in what they said because I could not know that the feeling of overwhelming grief would not last forever. And a lot of years have passed, 3 decades as a matter of fact. Just 2 months ago, it was 30 years. The mountain is still there. The mountain of pain is just as big as it was before. But now, the picture looks a little different. Same mountain, same picture. The mountain is just as big as it was before. The only difference between then and now is that the mountain's a little bit farther away. My perspective allows me to see more of the landscape around it. Because of time, I can see beauty that I couldn't see before. In fact, beauty has grown in ways that it didn't exist before. I just couldn't see that. Because of time, the bleeding that I experienced that I didn't think would ever stop has stopped, but it hasn't gone away. It's just turned into scars. The scars are real. The mountain is still there, but the bleeding stopped. I once again do experience joy. But I will say this, joy now is very different than it was before that experience. Because my joy has been shaped by my grief. It's different. It's deeper. It's richer. But my joy is often accompanied by tears now, where I didn't have tears before because I feel differently. Much, much differently. The tears come much frequently. That's the tension, beauty and pain. Joy and sorrow. We live in both. And the deeper the experience of one, pain, the deeper the potential of the other, joy. Now, some of you in here, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have experienced pain that you thought would kill you. Others in here, you haven't experienced that. I heard one time somebody say that we're always either in a storm, we're leaving a storm, or we're about to go into a storm. But our life is filled with storms. And I never want to compare pain, because loss is loss. If the greatest pain somebody has ever had is that they didn't get the scholarship and go to the school that they were hoping to go to, that pain is very, very real. If it's the greatest loss you've ever known, it's the greatest loss you've ever known. I don't want to minimize anybody's pain. And so I sure don't want to stand up here and act like, oh, feel bad for me or listen to me because I've experienced such depths of pain. There are people in this room right now who have experienced much deeper pain than I have. I only know the pain I've experienced, and it's the deepest pain I've ever experienced. So I'm talking from my own point of view, but I don't want to minimize yours. Some of you, your pain is very deep. And for some of you, maybe the person who says it's really deep, they would say to you, oh, yours isn't that deep, but it feels deep to you. And I want to acknowledge that. Fair enough? So we are all in the boat together. We are all in the pain boat together. And my hope is that this message, and I was so worried because there's sometimes it's like I have remembered things that sound like cliches now. I don't want to be trite about anything. So if I say something that feels like a cliche, I want you to know it actually means something to me. It really does. And so my question, the first question I was asking myself is it possible to recover from deep suffering? Is it possible to get over it? And I started thinking, I don't think it is, actually. If recovering means going back to life the way it was before, because I think when you're in it, that's what you want. When Jennifer died, all I wanted was for her to come back. If you'd have said, what is recovery? It would have been my life the way it was, the story that I was living the way it was. I want that story to keep going. And obviously that's just impossible. So tragedy sometimes forces us to begin a different, unforeseen, uninvited story that we have to live in, or we get to live in. It's not necessarily a better story, but it's not necessarily a worse story. It's just a different story. And when tragedy strikes, whether it be a death or a divorce or a diagnosis like cancer or Alzheimer's, maybe it's a disability, a downsizing, an assault, a car accident, a terrible choice, or an exposed behavior that has ruined everything. Or maybe somebody else's terrible choice or behavior that has changed everything for you. When something awful terminates the story that we are living, how do we find beauty and goodness again? How do we find joy in a different story? And as cliche as it does sound, when suffering overwhelms us, I use these terms, this so much. How do I become better rather than bitter? Because we all know people who have gone through suffering and it has made them bitter. And they have become angry. And maybe they have not just lost faith or abandoned faith. They are now on a rampage to make sure nobody else has faith either. We've seen this. If you haven't seen it in person, you've seen it in movies or books or television shows. We know the potential that pain has to create bitterness. How do we say no to that trajectory? And how do we get on a trajectory of becoming better, of actually living in a new story, a different story, and seeing beauty and goodness and allowing God to work in us? You know what? In the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament, there is no single person bigger than Moses. He's not just better. He is the best of all of the characters in the Old Testament. That's throughout Jewish history, nobody rose to the level of Moses. He delivered the Israelites from slavery. He spoke to God face to face. Moses was called the most humble person. He was humble and wise. He performed countless miracles. Moses even transcribed, he wrote down the Torah. The Jewish scriptures, the first 5 books, they're his. Moses is the greatest figure in the Jewish faith. And what's so often we forget is that for 2 chapters in the book of Exodus, Moses has a backstory. I say 2 chapters, it's actually more than that, but where we're going to be today is in those 2 chapters. Moses had a good life a very good life that was abruptly ended. Moses had a story that was terminated, and he could never, ever go back. And in the new story that was created, that's where the greatness was birthed. That's where the Moses we know was formed. See, Moses grew up the adopted grandchild of Pharaoh. Moses knew he was a Hebrew, but his life was very different from all of the other Hebrews in Egypt. They were all slaves. Moses was royalty. And as a young adult, Moses saw himself as the hero. He was 10 foot tall and bulletproof. I want you to look at what Exodus chapter 2:11 says. It says, one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people, the Hebrew slaves, were, and watched them at their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Verse 12, looking this way and that and seeing that nobody was around, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. Then, verse 15, when Pharaoh heard about what Moses had done, Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the desert in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Think about Moses' story. Because this is the end of one story and the beginning of another. Life as Moses knew it would never be the same again. I mean, he had royalty, he had wealth, power, comfort. All of that was ripped away in an instant. And it wasn't like months. For decades, Moses lived a hard blue-collar life in that Midian desert. He was rounding up sheep in the desert. If you're in Ireland, I can see sheep herding being something that's obviously you do. If you live in the desert, I don't know how you do that. So, but this became Moses' life. Royalty to working in the desert. Moses had no clue. And for decades, Moses was living a life of lowliness and suffering and pain. And he had no clue what the future held. In Egypt, he was Pharaoh's child. He was a child of Pharaoh. But in the wilderness, in the desert, herding sheep, that is where Moses became a child of God. It was in the suffering that Moses went from child of Pharaoh to child of God. And when he was a son of Pharaoh, think about it. Moses wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be a deliverer. But how did that end up? It ended up with a body buried in the sand. But as a child of God in the wilderness, God was able to forge Moses into the great leader that you and I read about today. A great leader that we are in this room today because of the story that began in Egypt back then, that led to Jesus, that led to us. All that Moses would become, everything he would accomplish, it was forged in the suffering. It was in the suffering that Moses slowly found God. Does that justify this? Does that justify the death of what? No, that's not what this is about. It happened. Now what? And God worked in the now what. Healing is always slow. Heartache, it lasts so long. I mean, heartache, grief, it shakes us up to the core. It creates doubt in us. It demands change. It's because we know we can't go back. Back is no longer an option. But if we allow it, if we choose it, our journey through the suffering can also awaken us to begin at reevaluating what really matters. Suffering changes our priorities. It changes our perspective. It did me anyway. If we want to become better and not bitter, and we look at suffering and we travel through suffering, like Moses, what happens is we begin to stop and to question and to reevaluate and to practice faith. Because it's in the wilderness, it's in the suffering that we become aware of what faith really is. See, I always thought that faith was believing without doubt, but it's not. What I learned in suffering is that faith is living out what you believe even when you doubt. Because I will be honest and say, and I thought about this all week to make sure it was true. When you hired me as your pastor 5 years ago, I still considered myself a deep doubter. And I told you that. I am a doubter. If you're a doubter, let's have a party, because I want to hang out with people like you. I love being around people like me. And I will say that for the first time in my life, I don't doubt near as much. I just have fallen so much more in love with doubters because I've been there. I know it. And I love it. I actually fought with some co-pastors one time because they were so angry that I doubted. They're like, "Why are you a pastor? You doubt too much." And I was going to counseling. I've always been going to counseling because doubt always ruled my life. And I just started realizing that, wait a minute, this is what God is doing in me. I like it. I don't like doubting. I like the journey that doubting has led me on, because you know what doubt does? It makes you seek out truth. And that's what I want to know. I want to know truth. I literally, none of what I'm sharing right now is part of my message, so now we're going to go over. Your fault. Just kidding. I remember sitting on my bed. I wrote a list. On one side of the list, it said reasons why I should stay a Christian. I really did this, honest to goodness. I just did a Scout's honor. I'm not a scout. Left side, why should I remain a Christian? Right side, why I should not. And I really mean this. When I sat down, my intention with my whole being was, whichever side won, that's the journey I was going to go on. I was 21. You know, I'd been a Christian for about 4 years at that point, maybe 5 years at that point. Faith was new. I was a youth pastor. I just left being a youth pastor because it's hard to be a youth pastor if you're not quite sure God is real. And it doesn't do well for the kids at all, and the parents hate that. And so I'm laying in bed and I'm writing this list. And the bottom line was the reasons for living a Christian life far outweighed the reasons for not. I mean, like, you know, short-term gain, not. Long-term gain, and I don't mean heaven. I just mean, like, when you make smart decisions, you face less bad consequences. And so I was writing all that out. But the bottom line for me was, if Jesus didn't rise, this is so crazy. I mean, I'm 21. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead for real, it doesn't matter. Christianity doesn't matter. But if he did rise from the dead for real, I need to deal with that. That one thing alone kept me in the game. And then I also stayed involved in a church because I figured if God is real, he would show me himself through his people. I probably wouldn't find him outside of his people. So I just figured the odds are better if the resurrection happened, which I wasn't sure at the time, but if it did happen, and if God is real, I would probably find out more being a part of his family than not. So I kept going to church. Isn't that weird? Isn't that so silly? That is the decision that saved my life. I am here today because I sat in bed, wrote these two lists, and then realized it really doesn't matter because I need to know the truth. And so I set out on a long path of is Jesus real? And that's frankly why I started the PhD program that I did, because I was like, I want to know, and I was scared because what if I find out the evidence is really sorry? It wasn't. Jesus really rose from the dead. I'm convinced of that. It is. I should probably get back to my notes now, so let me do that. So faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is living out what you believe, or what maybe you believed, or what you think you believe, but it's living as if it is true, even when you do doubt. That's all faith is. It's living it out, saying, and sometimes we can't even do it on our own faith. We have to use each other's faith. And that's what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where sometimes I am so broken and so hurting that I can't sing a song, I can't pray, I can't believe, but you can. And I can just hook my wagon to you and just follow you so that when you sing, you can sing for me. And when you pray, you can pray words for me. And when you believe, I can just say, they're not dumb. If they believe, maybe this is true. And maybe that's all that will get me through the next step, but that's okay. See, Moses didn't know he would be okay. He didn't know he would do anything great. He didn't know the story would go anywhere. He just survived at first. And at first, he crossed that desert alone. That was his only option. But then, when he started running into people, he started letting people into his life. And he slowly began a new life. And over time, he slowly had a heart that was open to God doing a work in him. See, without the wilderness, Moses' story would have been very different. But not just Moses' story, so would Israel's story. See, this is where it gets really important and I think really good. Israel, had Moses not gone through the wilderness, had Moses not had those moments where he finally said yes to what God asked him to do, Israel would have remained slaves. And we have no idea what that story would have looked like. No idea. But by embracing a new story, by choosing a trajectory of better over bitter, Moses gave God room to bring redemption to his story and to redeem the suffering. Moses' suffering led him to become the kind of man that God could use to lead a whole nation out of slavery. Does that minimize the suffering? No. Does it justify the suffering? I don't think so. Suffering is still awful. The stories that so abruptly ended, they were meaningful. My story before Jennifer died was significant. I had a whole picture of what life would be like. It ended. Is that okay? Does anything justify that? No. But if we choose the hard road of walking through our grief and dealing with it rather than ignoring it, with the help of family and friends and our church family and counselors, as we move farther and farther from the mountain of pain, our perspective can begin to change. And we can begin to see the pain, but also the beauty around the pain. The significance and direction and purpose and glory and life and joy in the midst of the tears. It's only possible because of pain that we can get to that depth. Because you can't change the loss, you can't change the pain, but you can change your trajectory. So you don't have any choices when it comes to where you are. But you can choose the direction that you're going. And you won't get there right away, but you will get there eventually. Often in the beginning, we dismiss the pain. You know, so many of friends of mine, so many people that I've known who have gone through major loss, they began anesthetizing themselves with the pain. You know, they worked more or drank more or partied more or took drugs or slept more. They avoided talking about their loss. And I get it. But running away from darkness doesn't lead to light. It just leads to longer darkness. And in my experience, light is actually found by going through the darkness. I read a book, when the sun is setting, you don't chase it to see the light. You have to run the other way into the darkness, and you will see the light on the other side. Sounds cliche, but boy, I haven't forgot it. This is what I learned in counseling. You know, after Jennifer's death, I made intentional decisions to spend time with friends, and I intentionally fostered times where we had conversation together. So I ate a lot of meals with friends. We'd go to movies, but then we would always go out afterwards and talk about the movie. And there was just lots and lots of time to process and talk. And I remember that on the first anniversary of Jennifer's death, my two best friends, Ronnie and Jason, they took me on a spontaneous trip to Disney World. Now, when you're standing in line for hours waiting for a ride, there's nothing to do but talk. And this was sadly before the days of cell phones, so we couldn't even play games. And so we're just standing there in the heat. And I remember all of those times just talking and processing, laughing and forgetting what day it was, but then having these moments of just boom, the weight would come back and just tears would well up. And this amazing day, I have to tell you, that day, my friends rescued me in a way that I could not have imagined. Because I remember going to bed that night going, I didn't dwell on the sadness of that day all day long like what I had thought was going to happen. It was a beautiful day. And here I am decades later, and I am so grateful that I was encouraged to be vulnerable and open my heart up to my friends and to engage the darkness and I probably was not fun to hang around, I'm thinking the first year. I probably was a sad mess, crying all the time. But they did. And I let them. And I don't know why, other than a counselor told me over and over, you can't isolate yourself. You have to have times of quiet, and then you have to have times of community. Quiet, community, quiet, community. And I did. And I am here today, I know, because of that. And so, in the process, I found God. I probably refound God because my faith slowly began to heal. I found wonder in the mundane, ordinary aspects of life. I began spending time listening and experiencing good stories. I experienced life in ways I didn't think possible. I eventually met my wife, Ray Lynn, my wife now. Have a beautiful family. 3 girls, a dog, 2 dogs soon. I remember feeling guilty after marrying Ray Lynn, and our first couple of years were tough because I was such a mess. I wasn't ready. But I remember feeling guilty every time I found joy with Ray Lynn, thinking, does that mean Jennifer didn't matter? I had to really wrestle with these kinds of things. And that's when I just started realizing one story ends, and whether you like it or not, a new story begins. It's just you get to choose what kind of story it is. Ray Lynn was a beautiful story. I could have chosen to drink too much. I could have. That's another story. Thank God I was rescued from that. I recognize that many of us aren't. That's why I say you can't help where you are. Your past has led you to where you are. It is the way it is. All you can do now is say, will my trajectory be the same or different? That is the choice. There is nothing we can do to stop pain, but there is so much we can do to respond to pain, and that's the choice. Do we face our pain, or do we deal with our pain, or do we ignore it? Do we build walls to keep people out, or do we invite people to walk with us in the suffering? How do we respond? I have a final story because I'm looking at the time, but I promise you, this plane is going to land. I've been circling, but the plane's coming down. In the Holy Land, right outside of Jerusalem, there is this valley called the Valley of Hinnom. In the New Testament, you would know this as Gehenna, hell. This is a picture of the Valley of Hinnom, right? You can see Jerusalem in the background, southern side. This is the Valley of Hinnom. In Moses' and David's time, this valley is where the ancient Canaanites and their descendants worshipped and appeased the god Molech by sacrificing children. They served a god who was so angry, so mad, so violent, so selfish, that the only way you could appease that God and maybe have rain for your crops or maybe have, your life be okay is that you would have to sacrifice a child in this valley. That is so horrendous that when the Israelites, when they began controlling this territory, they couldn't build on it. They made it the city dump for Jerusalem. Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, became a place of rotting garbage full of maggots and constantly burning fires as they were trying to get rid of the nastiness, And the prophets and later even Jesus warned Jerusalem that if they didn't walk in the ways of peace and justice, the whole city, Jerusalem, would end up just like Gehenna, a smoldering, maggot-infested hell. And it happened twice. First time was 587 BC when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. Solomon's amazing temple, the temple throughout the early parts of the Old Testament, it was obliterated, it was torn down. Tens and tens of thousands of Israelites were exiled out of Jerusalem and out of Israel, at the time Judah, and they were taken to Babylon. And that's where we have the books of Esther and Nehemiah. And these books were, and much of Ezekiel, they were written away from Jerusalem in the worst time that the Israelites had ever known. The second time that it happened, that Jerusalem became hell, Gehenna, was in 70 AD. And this was about 30 years after Jesus died, rose again, maybe 40 years, and Rome had laid siege to the city. Moms and dads, for months, watched their children starve as Rome would not allow food and water into the city. And it was one of the most horrific experiences, most horrific times in Jerusalem's history. And during that time, Rome destroyed the Second Temple. And it's never been rebuilt. When we go to Israel, we see Temple Mount. That's where the temple used to stand. But we're just looking at the foundation. Temple's gone. Suffering is the picture of Gehenna. It is hell, where maggots never die and the fire is never quenched, where hearts and lives are torn apart. And we wonder if there is any future at all. If you've ever had deep suffering, you would call it hell. It's awful. But I want to show you a picture of Gehenna today. Would you show the next picture? This is Gehenna today. If you visit Jerusalem right now, you can go south and you can go to this park. It is a beautiful, beautiful park. This awful, murderous valley has been transformed into an area of lawn and trees and fountains that never stop. Families sharing picnics, playing ball here. I was going to say football, but we know that's not true. But just throwing balls around. Once in a while, they have occasional evening concerts, and lots of people from Jerusalem will come and sit in the Valley of Hinnom, enjoying a beautiful time together, not just as family, but as people of Jerusalem, as people of Israel. My favorite part of this picture is there's a sign right outside the park. Go to the next slide. It says, "No fires allowed in the park." Isn't that hysterical? That you have hell, Gehenna, the valley of hell, has been created or turned into a park where it's too precious. We don't have fires here because we don't want anything to happen because it's just too pristine. I just love this. It's so ironic. This is the picture for me of God making all things new. This place, Gehenna, this is where children were sacrificed for the god Molech. This is where it was a dump of rotting maggots and never-ending fire as they continually were trying to burn it up and burn it up. This is the place. And look at it. It is beauty. God takes beauty or makes beauty from ashes. We have endured suffering, but we can also have hope that this is the future. That suffering and pain and grief and sorrow and regret and betrayal, that those are not the end of the story. The pain is not the end of the story. Death does not get the last word. Resurrection does. We are children of God, and He has already proven that. Resurrection is a real thing. Jesus died, but death could not keep hold on Him. Resurrection promises the death of death. And I'm telling you what, that is good news. Today's suffering, today's Gehenna is a place, a future place filled with beauty and life. Some now on this earth and much later. Suffering has the power to destroy you, it does, but it also has the power to transform you. God did not create suffering, but God is in the business of redeeming it. Suffering and dust, they can grind us. Suffering and loss can grind us into dust. But we all know that in creation, God does great things with dust. And He is continuing to do that. Final words. Jesus told Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. You know this passage. Everybody's talked about it. My power is strongest when you are weak. This is Jesus talking to Paul. My power is strongest when you are weak. Our weakness reveal His power. And it's because of this moment for Paul that he was able to say, next verse, we also glory in our sufferings. We glory in our sufferings. Not because suffering is good, but because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character. Character, hope. And verse 5 says, and hope does not put us to shame. Hope does not give us something to be ashamed of. God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. God is working through suffering, through our suffering, to do something good. Suffering is not good, but it can form good in us. Suffering can awaken us to the reality of God's presence. It can enlarge our capacity to live as God's image in the world, to live as God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. It's just all about choosing the trajectory. Do we become bitter or do we become better? And by the way, the journey to better is a long journey that sometimes has bitterness in it. It's all about trajectories. I want to invite the worship team to come up on stage, and I hope, as I'm preaching, I'm like, man, you really are circling the airport. And I hope that's okay. I didn't spend near as much time in the scriptures today, but I felt like Moses' story is so big and so relevant that I wanted to make sure that we talked about it. As they come up, I wanted to share that final word before I pray. There's a book that I read that gave a lot of language to today's message. I can't even express how much I wish I had this book when I was grieving the death of my wife. It's called A Grace Disguised by Jerry Sitzer. What makes me sad is that I didn't know about this book for about 20 years until after it was written. It really would have helped me. But they just came out with the 25th anniversary edition, and I have to tell you, if you get this book, get this one, because chapter 16, which is one of the two new chapters, is worth the price of the book itself. And you will read that, and you will go, Don cheated. Because it was very valuable. This book is in my soul. It is very valuable to me. I can't recommend it enough. So I just know that facing the struggle, journeying through the pain, that's the key. It's a slow journey, and you can't do it alone. And that's why we're here. You need a life group. You need people who are journeying with you. If you don't have people who you are intimate with and that you are close to, begin the journey. It's not about where you are. It's about trajectories. Start getting involved. Even if it's just taking advantage of some of the interactive devotions that I have recommended over the last couple of weeks. And they're all in our bulletin under the sermon resources. It's, if nothing else, just a beginning point to begin relationships, because you can't become better alone. You have to have people with you. Start looking for a life group, or if I know most of them are closing up for the summer, but some are still going, and we'll have new life groups in the fall. Make sure you are a part of people's lives. And that's why we offer a group of, a list of counselors online, because sometimes we just need more help than what a friend can offer. We need professional help. I do. And I just want to encourage us. May we get on that trajectory. And let's just pray. And I'm just going to pray that God leads us, because every one of us has a different story. Jesus, I want to thank you. I want to thank you that you're doing a work and that you are so good that you can bring beauty from ashes. You can bring life from death. But God, right now in this family, we have people who are hurting. We have people who have been hurting for a long time. There's probably people listening or in this room right now who have never experienced hope, a trajectory of hope. And so I pray, God, that today, if nothing else, you will give them hope that there is hope. You will give them the beginning of a trajectory that is going to be long. But God, that is one that you will work in. Help us to, as a people and as individuals, to become better, not bitter. Because bitter is a long, lonely road, Lord. But you want to provide life. So thank you, Jesus, that you are the bread of life. You are the one who resurrects. We need resurrection, Jesus. We need resurrection. Do a work, Lord, in this song, in our future, and in our family. Amen. Would you lead us?